Along the intricate coastline of the Pacific Northwest, where the sea weaves its way deep into the land, an ancient rhythm endures. It is the rhythm of the tides, the rhythm of the salmon, and the rhythm of the canoe. For thousands of years, this has been the homeland of a diverse family of nations, a people whose story is inseparable from the water and the land that sustains them. They are known today, collectively, as the Salish peoples. The name Salish is not a single tribal identity, but a term coined by linguists to describe a family of more than 24 distinct languages and many more dialects. It is an external label, an anglicization of Salish, the name the people of the Flathead Reservation use for themselves. As the easternmost Salish people and the first to establish diplomatic ties with the United States, their name was broadly applied to all who spoke a related tongue. Yet within this linguistic family, each nation has its own name, its own history, its own distinct identity. From the Musqueam heart of modern Vancouver to the Salish Clispe of Montana, they represent a confederation of cultures bound by the threads of shared ancestry and language. This vast territory is broadly divided into two worlds: the interior Salish, living in the upper basins of the Columbia and Fraser rivers, adapted to the drier plateau. Their lives were shaped by the river systems, the Camas prairies, and for those in the east, the great bison hunts. But to the west, along the coast, a different world unfolded, a world defined by a unique inland sea. This body of water, officially named the Salish Sea in 1988, is the heart of the Coast Salish world. It is one of the largest and most biologically rich inland seas on the planet, a place where salt water from the Pacific Ocean mixes with fresh water from countless rivers, creating a vibrant ecosystem that has supported human life for millennia. For the Coast Salish, these waters were never a barrier, they were an ancestral marine highway, a network of channels connecting communities through kinship, ceremony, and trade. The modern name is a long overdue tribute to the sea's first inhabitants and a recognition that this is a single, unified ecosystem, artificially divided by a recent invention, the international border between the United States and Canada. The connection of the Salish peoples to this land is one of staggering depth. Colonial narratives once suggested they were recent arrivals, but their own oral histories speak of a presence since time immemorial. Science now affirms this ancient truth. Archaeological evidence reveals continuous occupation of this territory for more than 10,000 years, with works of art in stone, bone, and basketry dating back at least 5,000 years. This is not a story of migration. It is the story of one of the continent's most deeply rooted civilizations, a people who did not simply live on the land, but were an integral part of it. Their identity was, and remains, a reflection of this profound and ancient belonging. In a powerful act of reclaiming this identity, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation, once known as the anglicized Salish Penjarail, officially changed their name to Salish Clispe in 2016. It was part of a wider movement to restore their language and culture, a declaration that their identity would no longer be defined by outsiders, but by themselves. For a civilization to thrive for 10 millennia in one place requires more than simple survival. It requires a relationship with the environment built on deep knowledge, sophisticated technology, and profound respect. For the Salish peoples, this relationship was centered on two sacred gifts of the land, two beings that provided the foundation for nearly every aspect of their material and spiritual world: the western red cedar and the salmon. To the Coast Salish, the western red cedar is not merely a tree. It is known as the tree of life, as grandmother, and long life maker. This single species provided the foundation for their entire civilization. Its wood, lightweight, straight-grained, and naturally resistant to rot, was the perfect material for shelter. From its mighty trunks, Salish builders constructed vast longhouses, the heart of every village. These post and beam structures could stretch for hundreds of feet, providing communal homes for multiple related families. The planks could even be removed from the permanent frame and transported to summer camps, making the home itself adaptable to the seasons. Cedar was the key to transportation across the ancestral marine highways of the Salish Sea. Its buoyant and durable wood was ideal for carving the magnificent canoes that were central to Salish life. Canoe building was a highly specialized and spiritual art. A master carver would seek guidance from a dream spirit, often the pileated woodpecker, before selecting a tree that was hundreds of years old. After felling the tree with reverence and ceremony, the log would be painstakingly hollowed out. Hot water and heated rocks were then placed inside, steaming the wood until it was pliable enough to be spread, widening the beam and raising the bow and stern to create a vessel both stable and swift. Different designs were perfected for different purposes: the sleek, high-prowed ocean-going canoe for navigating the rough, open water, and the practical, flat-bottomed, shovel-nosed canoe for poling up shallow rivers. But the gifts of the cedar extended far beyond its wood. Its versatile bark was just as vital. Peeled from the tree in long strips, the soft inner bark could be processed into fibers and woven into durable, water-resistant clothing like skirts and capes, as well as mats, rope, and fishing nets. The roots of the cedar, carefully harvested, were split and used to create strong, watertight coiled baskets, so tightly woven they could be used for cooking by dropping heated rocks into the water they held. From a single cedar plank, steamed and bent, a carver could create the iconic bent wood box, a vessel used for anything from storing food to serving as a burial box for the deceased. The use of cedar was not just practical, it was sacred. The tree was seen as a living being with its own spirit, and every act of harvesting and carving was accompanied by rituals of gratitude and respect, an acknowledgement of the life-giving relationship between the people and the forest. If cedar was the roof over their heads, salmon was the fire in their hearth. For countless generations, the predictable return of the 5 species of Pacific salmon was the economic and cultural lifeblood of the Salish world. Many nations of the Pacific Northwest define themselves as salmon people, for salmon was the most important gift of food from the Creator. This relationship was governed by a profound spiritual covenant. Salmon were not seen as a mere resource to be harvested, but as gift-bearing relatives who lived in their own world under the sea. According to traditional beliefs, the salmon people put on robes of salmon skin each year and sacrificed themselves to feed the humans. In return, the humans had a sacred obligation to treat them with respect. This obligation was embodied in the first salmon ceremony. When the first large salmon of the season was caught, it was brought to the village and honored. After being ceremonially cooked and shared by everyone, its bones were carefully returned to the river with its head pointing upstream. This was to ensure its spirit could return to the salmon people and tell them that the humans had shown proper respect, making it safe for the rest of the salmon to come upstream. This ritual was the cornerstone of a worldview based on reciprocity and renewal, a guarantee that if the people upheld their responsibilities, the salmon would always return. This spiritual contract was supported by an array of ingenious and highly efficient fishing technologies, each adapted to a specific environment. On the coast, the Salish set massive reef nets made of willow and cedar in the path of migrating salmon. In the rivers, communities built elaborate weirs, fence-like structures that channeled fish into traps or to waiting fishers. These weirs were not indiscriminate barriers. They often had removable panels that could be opened to allow a portion of the run to escape upstream, ensuring the spawning grounds were replenished and that upriver communities received their share. This was a sophisticated system of resource management guided by a conservation ethic that predates the modern concept by millennia. The abundance of salmon provided a reliable food surplus that formed the basis of wealth trade, and a complex society, allowing the Salish to develop a rich ceremonial life without the need for agriculture. The relationship with salmon was, and is, the very definition of Salish identity. The world that the first European explorers encountered was not a wilderness inhabited by scattered, disorganized bands. It was a landscape shaped by a complex and deeply ordered society, governed by ancient laws and traditions. This social order was centered in the great longhouses and expressed through powerful ceremonies that maintained balance, distributed wealth, and recorded history. The cedar plank longhouse was a microcosm of Salish society. These immense structures, sometimes extending for more than 200 feet, were the primary building type for over 2,500 years. They were more than just shelter, they were the center of all community life.
Inside, multiple generations of a single extended family lived and worked together. The house was a workshop for carving and weaving, a kitchen for preparing and storing food, and a hall for multi-generational affairs. Social status was reflected in the home's layout, with the lineage leader and their immediate family occupying the prestigious rear of the house, while other families had their designated spaces along the sides. Governance was rooted in kinship, with loosely organized bands of related families forming autonomous villages, each with its own chief and territory. These villages were connected to their neighbors through marriage, shared resources, and ceremony, creating a web of relationships that spanned the entire Salish Sea region. The most important of these ceremonies, the central institution of Salish law and governance, was the potlatch. The word comes from the New Channel term patchlat, meaning to give. But a potlatch was far more than a simple feast or gift-giving. It was a complex and formal event that functioned as the society's primary mechanism for validating social order. Potlatches were held to mark every significant life event: a birth, a marriage, a death, or the assumption of a new name or title. At these gatherings, the host family would validate their claims to rank and privilege by distributing vast quantities of property, food, blankets, canoes, carved items, and later European trade goods to their assembled guests. The logic of the potlatch was a direct inversion of the European concept of wealth. Status was not demonstrated by what one accumulated, but by what one could afford to give away. The more a host gave, the greater their prestige. This system of reciprocal obligation was a powerful social glue. To receive a gift at a potlatch meant you were obligated to one day host your own potlatch and give back gifts of even greater value. This created a dynamic circulation of wealth throughout the community, acting as a form of social insurance that ensured no family would fall into destitution. If one village had a poor salmon run, they could attend the potlatch of a more fortunate neighbor and return home with the resources needed to survive the winter. In a society without a written language, the potlatch served a crucial legal function. It was at these public gatherings that a family's intangible property, their rights to names, songs, dances, and crests, were publicly displayed, recited, and transferred to their heirs. The guests who received gifts were not just attendees, they were official witnesses. Their memory of the proceedings served as a living record, giving legal weight to the transfers of power and property. During the long, dark winters, the longhouse was filled with the telling of squawachiam, the stories from long ago, and squelquil, the true news of the people. This oral tradition was the library, the courthouse, and the classroom of the Salish world, ensuring that the laws and history of the people were passed down intact from one generation to the next. This intricate system of governance, economics, and law maintained a stable and prosperous society for thousands of years, a society perfectly adapted to the rhythms of the Salish Sea. Into this world in balance, a new force arrived. The coming of Europeans in the late 18th century was not a single event, but a series of cascading disruptions that would irrevocably alter the Salish world. The first and most devastating wave was invisible, arriving years before any sustained contact, carried along the very trade routes that had connected indigenous nations for centuries. The peoples of the Americas had no immunity to the diseases the newcomers carried. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the population in what are known as virgin soil epidemics, with catastrophic results. The first major smallpox epidemic to strike the Pacific Northwest occurred in the 1770s, likely spreading from a Spanish expedition. It was a biological apocalypse. In some areas, 90% of the population perished. Entire villages disappeared. When the British explorer George Vancouver sailed into Puget Sound in the 1790s, he described seeing abandoned villages and meeting survivors whose faces were scarred by the pockmarks of the disease, witnesses to a catastrophe that had already happened. This demographic collapse was not just a human tragedy, it was a strategic blow that crippled the Salish societies. With the death of so many elders, vast stores of oral knowledge were lost forever. The loss of hunters and gatherers led to starvation, and traditional healing systems were overwhelmed by maladies they had never encountered. The societies the first traders and settlers would meet were not in their original state. They were societies in mourning, struggling to survive in a post-apocalyptic world. The next wave was economic. In the early 19th century, British and American fur trading companies arrived, with the Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, emerging as the dominant force. They established a network of trading posts, with Fort Langley built on the Fraser River in 1827 and Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island in 1843. These forts became powerful new centers of gravity, fundamentally altering the traditional Salish economy. In exchange for furs, particularly beaver and sea otter, Salish people could acquire manufactured goods, metal tools that made carving easier, firearms that changed hunting and warfare, and wool blankets that became a new form of wealth. But this new trade created dependency and shifted focus from subsistence to trapping for a global market, leading to the rapid depletion of fur-bearing animals. The Hudson's Bay Company also encouraged its employees to marry high-ranking indigenous women, creating strategic alliances that secured trade networks but also introduced complex new social dynamics into Salish communities. The fur trade was the vanguard of colonization, an economic wedge that opened the door for the political and cultural changes that would follow. The final wave was ideological. Beginning in the 1840s, Catholic and Protestant missionaries arrived with the goal of converting the Salish peoples to Christianity. Men like the Jesuit priest Pierre-Jean de Smet established missions, such as St. Mary's in 1841, bringing with them not just a new religion, but a new worldview that was fundamentally at odds with Salish traditions. They viewed the complex spiritual life of the Salish, with its guardian spirits and sacred ceremonies, as paganism and devil worship. Their mission was to civilize the savage, to replace traditional beliefs with Christian doctrine and communal living with settled agriculture. While some Salish people were drawn to the new faith, the missionaries' efforts often created deep divisions within communities, pitting converts against those who held to the old ways. When the missionaries at St. Mary's also established a mission for the Blackfeet, the traditional enemies of the Salish, many felt betrayed, and the mission was ultimately destroyed in an attack. This three-pronged assault, biological, economic, and religious, shattered the balance of the Salish world, leaving them vulnerable to the final and most permanent disruption, the loss of their land. By the mid-19th century, the trickle of newcomers had become a flood. Spurred by the promise of free land under policies like the American Donation Land Claim Act, thousands of settlers poured into the Pacific Northwest, encroaching on Salish territories. To legitimize this settlement and extinguish indigenous title to the land, the colonial governments of Britain and the United States initiated a rapid and deeply flawed process of treaty-making. This process was defined by a fundamental clash of worldviews. To the settlers, land was a commodity, a piece of private property to be bought, sold, and exclusively owned. To the Salish, land was the source of life and identity, a sacred inheritance that could be shared but never permanently alienated.
On Vancouver Island, between 1850 and 1854, James Douglas, the governor of the colony and chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, negotiated a series of 14 agreements known as the Douglas Treaties. These were framed as simple land purchases. In exchange for goods like cash and blankets, various First Nations surrendered vast territories, retaining only their small village sites and enclosed fields. A crucial clause promised that they could continue to hunt and fish as formerly on the unoccupied ceded lands. However, the legitimacy of these treaties has been fiercely contested. Oral histories and historical analysis suggest that many leaders did not understand they were permanently surrendering their land, and in some cases may have made their mark on blank ledger pages, with the written terms inserted later by colonial officials. Across the border, in the newly formed Washington Territory, Governor Isaac Stevens pursued an even more aggressive treaty campaign in 1854 and 1855. His explicit goal was to concentrate the many disparate tribes onto a few small reservations, clearing the way for American settlement. In a whirlwind of councils, he negotiated treaties like the Treaty of Medicine Creek with the peoples of southern Puget Sound, and the Treaty of Point Elliott with the nations to the north, including the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Snoqualmie. These were not good faith negotiations. The councils were conducted in Chinook jargon, a trade pidgin with a limited vocabulary of only a few hundred words, completely inadequate for conveying complex legal concepts. The outcomes were predetermined. At the Point-No-Point Treaty Council, for example, after the chiefs refused to agree on the first day, they returned the next morning to find the final treaty document already prepared for their signature. In exchange for ceding millions of acres of their homeland, the land that now comprises cities like Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma, the tribes were promised small reservations and meager payments in the form of annuities. Many of the promised reservations, like the one for the Duwamish people of Chief Seattle, were never established due to fierce opposition from local settlers who petitioned the government, claiming the land would be of little value to the Indians. The treaties were immediately violated by settlers, sparking the Puget Sound War of 1855 to 1858. But their most enduring and contentious legacy was embedded in a single, deceptively simple clause repeated in treaty after treaty. The right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory. To the Salish leaders who insisted on this language, it was a guarantee that their most fundamental way of life would be preserved forever. To the United States government, it was a temporary privilege that could be regulated and eventually extinguished by the state. This deliberate ambiguity planted the seeds of a conflict that would smolder for a century before erupting into open warfare on the rivers of the Pacific Northwest. The treaties confined the Salish peoples to small reservations, but the colonial project sought more than just their land. It sought their very identity. In both Canada and the United States, governments enacted policies aimed at the total assimilation of Indigenous peoples. It was a coordinated campaign of cultural destruction, waged on two fronts, one against the public life of the community, the other against the private life of the family and the child. In Canada, the government took aim at the heart of Coast Salish governance, the potlatch. To colonial officials and missionaries, the ceremony of giving away wealth was incomprehensible. They saw it as wasteful, barbaric, and a primary obstacle to instilling the capitalist values of private property and wealth accumulation. In 1884, the Canadian government amended the Indian Act, making it a criminal offense to participate in or even assist in a potlatch ceremony. The law stated that any Indian or other person who engages in or assists in celebrating the Indian festival known as the potlatch is guilty of a misdemeanor and shall be liable to imprisonment. The potlatch ban, which remained in effect for 61 years until 1951, was an attempt to legislate a culture out of existence. It drove the ceremonies underground, forcing communities to practice their most important traditions in secret under constant threat of arrest. The law was wielded as a tool of oppression. The most notorious enforcement action occurred in 1921 after Namgish chief Dan Cranmer hosted a massive 6-day potlatch in the village of Alert Bay. Indian agents raided the ceremony, arresting 45 participants. They were offered a cruel choice: go to prison or surrender all of their sacred potlatch regalia. To save their relatives from jail, the community handed over hundreds of priceless ancestral items: masks, rattles, headdresses, and coppers that embodied their history and spiritual power. 22 people were still sent to prison. These confiscated treasures were sold off to museums across Canada, the United States, and Europe, a devastating loss that scattered the cultural heritage of the Kwakwaka'wakw people across the globe.